The year is 1967. The world is a Cold War chessboard. And the highest stakes game is played 100 miles above the Earth. America had the moon in its sights. But Moscow was determined to own the present. They needed a spectacle. A triumph so grand it would silence the West for a generation. The Soviet Union's answer was the Soyuz program. The Union. A revolutionary spacecraft, designed not just for orbit, but for docking, for building a permanent presence in the heavens. It was complex. It was ambitious. And it was desperately, fatally rushed. Engineers, the best minds in the Soviet Empire, saw the flaws. They documented them. They screened them. Over 200 known design defects plagued the new Soyuz design. The problems were not minor, they were fundamental. The thermal control system was suspect. The navigation sensors were unreliable. And worst of all, the lifeblood of the capsule, the parachute system, had failed repeatedly in uncrewed tests. On the verge of the first crewed flight, the pressure from the party, from the highest levels of the Kremlin, became an unbearable, physical weight. Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary, demanded a spectacular space rendezvous. An orbital handshake. He demanded it by May Day. The original plan called for 2 separate Soyuz missions. Soyuz 1, carrying a single cosmonaut, would launch first. The next day, Soyuz 2, carrying 3 crewmen, would launch. They would rendezvous. They would dock. The world would watch a perfect Soviet ballet in orbit. The cosmonaut assigned to the solo mission, the man who knew the risks better than anyone, was Colonel Vladimir Komarov. A veteran of the Voskhod program, a brilliant, grounded engineer. Komarov had seen the internal reports. He had read the chilling details of the failures. He knew, with a certainty that must have felt like a physical sickness, that this mission was catastrophically flawed. One document, a 10-page internal memo listing 203 structural problems, circulated among the key decision-makers. It was a death warrant signed by the best minds in the program. But it was suppressed. The political calendar trumped engineering integrity. Komarov understood the choice. To refuse was to destroy the careers of his friends, his colleagues, his superiors. To challenge Brezhnev was unthinkable. He was trapped. The word filtered down from the top, the mission will fly. Komarov's backup, his friend, was a man named Yuri Gagarin. The first man in space. Gagarin, deeply troubled, reportedly signed his own technical assessment, stating the vehicle was not ready, and urged a delay. The irony was devastating. The hero of the Soviet Union could not save his friend. The date was set. April 23, 1967. The launch window was closing. The engineers were silent. The party was expectant. And Komarov, knowing he was climbing into a fragile tin can packed with 200 failures, made his final farewells. He was a professional. He was a patriot. He was a ghost walking to his own funeral pyre. The countdown began, and an entire empire held its breath. The stage was set for a disaster that would shatter the Soviet myth of infallibility. The pre-dawn silence at Baikonur was thick with tension. Vladimir Komarov was sealed inside the tiny orbital module of Soyuz 1. He was alone. But his fate was linked to the fate of the nation. The political imperative was overwhelming. The 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution was approaching, and Brezhnev demanded a spectacular space flight to mark the milestone. He wanted the world to see the Soviets not just catch up, but leapfrog the Americans. This wasn't science, it was propaganda. And propaganda demanded sacrifice. The engineers knew the statistics. The uncrewed test flights, known as Cosmos 133 and Cosmos 140, had delivered terrifying results. Cosmos 133 nearly cooked the capsule during re-entry. Cosmos 140 suffered a catastrophic structural failure, causing it to burn up completely. The problems were not fixed. They were merely rationalized away. The chief designer, Sergei Korolev, the undisputed architect of the Soviet space program, had died suddenly a year prior. His successor, Vasily Mishin, was a brilliant man but lacked the political muscle to resist the Kremlin's demands. Mishin was caught between the technical reality and the political guillotine. He was pressured to sign the final readiness documents. He signed. Komarov, waiting for the ignition sequence, had done all he could. Just hours before the launch, he met privately with the KGB's directorate. He didn't ask for clemency or a delay. He delivered 2 envelopes. One contained final instructions for his wife, Valentina. The other contained a searing indictment of the political recklessness that had allowed the mission to proceed. He was making sure that if he died, the truth would not die with him. The pressure was not an abstract concept, it was a deadline measured in days. The Americans were planning their own new generation Apollo launch. The Soviets needed to launch first. The race was relentless, and the finish line was now. T-10 seconds. The ground shivered. Komarov made his final check. He knew the risk was not 50-50. It was near certainty. He had reportedly told friends that he was going to be the man who went up and was not coming back. But he went. He was protecting Gagarin. If Komarov refused, Gagarin would be ordered to take his place. Komarov chose to die, rather than allow his friend, the Soviet Union's greatest hero, to be sacrificed. He was a man of quiet, devastating honor. At 3:35 a.m., the R-7 rocket roared to life, shedding the embrace of the Earth. The colossal machine, pushing 600,000 pounds of metal and fuel, climbed into the blackness. The vibration was immense. The noise was deafening. Soyuz 1 was finally committed to orbit. But within minutes, the first chilling reports began to filter back to mission control. The silence in the control room was profound. They had achieved orbit. But the spacecraft that carried Komarov was already crippled. The first of the 200 flaws had manifested. The flight had barely begun, and the countdown to disaster was now ticking down at an accelerated, terrifying rate. Soyuz 1 had made it to orbit. But within moments of the orbital insertion, the delicate, intricate systems of the new generation spacecraft began to fail. Not one system. Not two. A cascade of failures began that would transform the mission from a triumphant ballet into a desperate, silent struggle for survival. The primary flaw appeared almost instantly: one of the 2 solar panels, crucial for generating power and providing directional stability, failed to deploy. It remained stubbornly, uselessly folded against the side of the service module. Without both solar panels, the craft was starved of power. The batteries were draining faster than anticipated. But the failure had a more terrifying consequence: without the balanced deployment, the spacecraft's navigational sensors, particularly the critical star trackers, could not function correctly. Komarov was flying a blind, crippled machine. The spacecraft's orientation system, the D-unit, failed. Then the ion flow sensors, essential for determining the horizon, failed. The ship began to slowly tumble. Komarov, the experienced test pilot and engineer, fought to stabilize the ship. He was a professional in the truest sense, calmly relaying the litany of failures back to the stunned controllers in Tyuratam. The crucial component for a successful re-entry, the KDU engine, relied on a precise alignment of the spacecraft. But Komarov couldn't achieve it. He was now spiraling, unable to find the required, perfect celestial fix to fire his main engine. The entire purpose of the mission, the orbital rendezvous with Soyuz 2, was now utterly impossible. The command came down from the Kremlin: abort the mission. The launch of Soyuz 2, which would have carried 3 more cosmonauts to their probable deaths, was immediately scrubbed. Komarov was alone in the void. His task was no longer to achieve a political victory, but simply to survive the next 24 hours. For the rest of the first day in orbit, Komarov wrestled with the dying ship. He manually tried to position the solar panel, a futile effort from inside the cabin. He used his remaining maneuvering propellant in a desperate attempt to stop the wild, uncontrolled spin. Mission Control could only offer suggestions, calculations, and encouragement. They were helpless observers of a death struggle occurring hundreds of miles above them. The communication link between Komarov and Mission Control became a lifeline of increasingly desperate, technical exchanges. They needed to find a window, a brief, perfect alignment with the Earth that would allow a manual engine burn. As he began his 16th orbit, Komarov managed a temporary, near-miraculous stabilization. He was a fighter. But the time was running out. His batteries were almost dead. His guidance system was irreparable. He was running cold, low on oxygen, and critically, he was entering the narrow window for a necessary deorbit burn. The ground controllers knew his chances were vanishingly thin. As he passed over the Soviet Union for the final time in that dark, cold segment of the flight, the communications crackled one last time. Komarov's voice, though strained, was calm. He reported the ship's condition. He prepared for the impossible. The decision was made. He would attempt a manual re-entry on his next pass. It was a Hail Mary pass into the atmosphere. Everyone listening knew, this was his final roll of the dice. The moment of truth arrived during the 19th orbit. Komarov, relying on his extraordinary skill and instinct, managed to align the crippled Soyuz 1 for a precise burn. It was a feat of pure piloting, navigating a spinning ship without proper guidance. He fired the main engine. It worked. The thrust was correct. The spacecraft began its final, irreversible descent toward Earth. Mission Control erupted in a brief, agonizing moment of relief. They had a trajectory. He was coming home. But the relief was short-lived. The problems that plagued the ship were not confined to orbit, they were baked into the design. As the spacecraft plunged into the Earth's atmosphere, the extreme heat and G-forces began to place unimaginable stress on the already compromised vehicle. The process of re-entry demanded a flawless separation of the three main modules, the orbital module, the descent module, Komarov's cabin, and the service module. The descent module, containing Komarov, had to be isolated to ensure the heat shield took the full force of the deceleration, but a failure to jettison the other modules correctly could be fatal. Komarov was experiencing forces up to 8 times the force of gravity. He was battered, exhausted, but alive. Then, the terrifying, final communication began. As the ship descended, Komarov's voice crackled over the radio one last time. It was a broken transmission, filled with static, rage, and profound sadness. The recording is a classified ghost of the Cold War. While the full, unedited transcript remains sealed, reports from key personnel at Mission Control, including alleged transcripts from the nearby American listening post in Istanbul, confirmed the chilling content. Komarov spoke of the extreme heat. He spoke of his exhaustion. And crucially, he spoke of the betrayal. He allegedly knew, with a certainty that could only come in those final moments, that he was utterly, irrevocably doomed. Mission Control could only listen. Yuri Gagarin, who was on duty, was reportedly crying. He was speaking to his friend, his comrade, knowing he was speaking to a dead man. The communication, though intermittent, went on for minutes, an unbearable public airing of a private, state-sponsored tragedy. The final words heard by the controllers were not of heroism or glory, but of despair. Komarov's life was literally being squeezed out of him, not by a hostile environment, but by a flawed machine that the state demanded fly. The crucial re-entry maneuver had been completed. He was decelerating. He was heading for the designated landing zone in the Orenburg region. Now came the final, most critical phase, the parachute deployment. Every surviving system, every prayer, every engineering hope was pinned on the ribbons of fabric packed into the top of the capsule. They were the last line of defense. And they were about to deliver the final, brutal twist of the knife. The radio link snapped shut. Silence. But it was not the peaceful silence of a successful landing. It was the absolute, crushing silence of total catastrophic failure. The Soyuz descent module, a heavy, charred bell of metal, was screaming toward the Earth at hundreds of miles per hour. It was heading for the open, flat steppes near the city of Orsk. The speed was immense, but survivable, if the parachutes functioned. The procedure was precise. First, a small drogue chute was to deploy, stabilizing the capsule and pulling out the larger braking chute. The braking chute would then slow the descent enough for the enormous, 30-foot main parachute to deploy, gently settling the module onto the ground. But the flaws ran deep. When the compartment hatch blew open, the first small pilot parachute, the essential starting gun for the sequence, deployed. The braking parachute followed. But when the time came for the gigantic, all-important main parachute to inflate, it failed. It did not tear. It did not malfunction. It simply refused to deploy. A post-mortem investigation would later reveal the brutal truth: a pressure sensor failure meant that the main canopy had not been properly seated in its storage container. The canopy lines became hopelessly tangled, forming a knot of nylon and steel that made inflation impossible. Komarov was now dropping, not floating. The braking chute, though deployed, could not possibly slow the module enough. The descent speed was still catastrophic. It was the difference between landing and impact. In a final, desperate move, Komarov tried to activate the backup, reserve parachute. It was a long shot. The reserve canopy was rigged to a completely separate explosive charge, but it had to be deployed after the main canopy had been cut away. Komarov managed to jettison the tangled mess of the main chute. The reserve chute blasted out. But the speed was too great. The reserve chute, designed for a much slower deployment, immediately became entangled in the already streaming, tangled remnants of the primary system. Or, more likely, the extreme aerodynamic forces at that velocity instantly tore the delicate silk canopy to shreds. Komarov was now in a freefall, his metal cocoon hurtling towards the hard ground of the Soviet Union. His speed was reportedly over 200 miles per hour. He had survived the political pressure, the launch, the 24-hour struggle in a crippled spacecraft, the atmospheric re-entry, only to be defeated by a tangled knot of nylon. On the steppes below, a detachment of Soviet recovery troops was waiting. They had tracked the signal. They saw the descent module, not floating gracefully, but plummeting like a lead weight. There was no gentle rocking. There was no cloud of earth kicked up by a soft landing. There was only the sound of a massive, concussive impact. The impact crater was shallow, a testament to the speed and the sheer weight of the capsule. A pillar of black smoke immediately rose against the pale sky. The recovery troops raced toward the smoke, knowing instinctively what they would find. They were no longer there for a triumph. They were there for a retrieval. The tragedy was complete. The most anticipated flight in Soviet history had ended in a smoking, twisted, and entirely avoidable wreck. The scene on the steppes of the Orenburg region was not a crash site. It was an instant incineration. The impact, at over 200 miles per hour, had instantly crushed the descent module into a compact, smoking cylinder of twisted metal. But the most horrifying result was the fire. The high-speed impact ruptured the remaining propellant tanks, bathing the wreckage in a chemical firestorm. When the recovery team finally reached the smoking ruin, they were met with an agonizing sight. The descent module was reduced to a blackened sphere. The heat was so intense that all the organic matter inside was consumed. What was recovered was barely recognizable as a human being. The political machine that demanded the mission now had to deal with the physical reality of its failure. The immediate response was a suffocating layer of absolute secrecy. The official announcement was brief and utterly misleading: Komarov had died during re-entry due to a parachute failure. No mention of the 200 prior defects. No mention of the political pressure. The death of Vladimir Komarov was immediately reframed, not as a technical or political failure, but as a heroic, isolated tragedy in the name of Soviet progress. The state funeral was a full-scale propaganda event. Komarov was granted a state burial in the Kremlin wall. He was posthumously made a hero of the Soviet Union. The world saw the grief, the military spectacle, the endless wreaths. What the world did not see was the immediate, terrifying inquest taking place behind closed doors. The Soviet leadership, including Brezhnev, understood the catastrophic implications. If the Americans discovered the full extent of the technical failures, the hundreds of documented faults, the Soviet space program would be seen not as an innovator, but as a reckless, arrogant gambler. The pressure on the engineering team was immense. The lead investigator, Colonel General Kamenin, was tasked with writing the official report. He knew the truth. He knew the mission should never have launched. But the report had to protect the party. It had to protect the hierarchy. The official findings blamed the parachute failure on a combination of factors, including extreme heat and atmospheric conditions, anything but a fundamental design flaw known for months. The true culprits, the tangle of wires and the pressure sensor failure, were buried deep in the classified appendix. The message was clear: the mission was a technical failure, not a political one. But Komarov's quiet protest, the 2 envelopes he left with the KGB, ensured that the full story would not die. His actions were a silent indictment of the entire Soviet system. The ashes of Soyuz 1 were quickly swept away, but the shockwaves of the disaster spread instantly through the space program. The planned orbital rendezvous, the centerpiece of the May Day celebration, was not just cancelled. The entire Soyuz program was put on hold. The Soviets' next crewed flight would not occur for another 18 months. The race to the moon had just lost its momentum. The Americans had won a crucial, albeit tragic, head start. The cost, the life of a brave, principled cosmonaut who knew he was being sent to his death. The death of Vladimir Komarov did not end the Soviet space program, but it fundamentally changed it. The lessons learned, paid for with the life of a cosmonaut, were devastatingly clear: haste kills. The post-Soyuz 1 inquest led to a complete, meticulous overhaul of the entire Soyuz design. Every single one of the 200 reported flaws was addressed. The parachute system was redesigned, retested, and built with a margin of safety that was previously considered politically expendable. The heat shield, the thermal controls, the attitude sensors, all were re-engineered with an almost obsessive dedication. This disaster became the space program's crucible. The immediate personal impact was perhaps the most profound. Yuri Gagarin, who had desperately tried to save Komarov, was completely shattered by his friend's death. He publicly blamed the political pressures and the lack of engineering diligence. The Kremlin, terrified of losing its greatest icon, immediately grounded him. Gagarin was forbidden from training for any future space flights. His fate was sealed on Earth, forced into a role as a public relations figure, forever haunted by the friend he couldn't save. He would himself die in a mysterious jet crash less than a year later, a man fundamentally changed by the events of April 1967. Yet, out of the ashes of Soyuz 1, the most reliable spacecraft in human history was ultimately born. The current-day Soyuz spacecraft, which has carried crews to the Salyut, Mir, and international space stations, is a direct, safer descendant of the fatal prototype. Its continuous service for over 5 decades is the true, grim legacy of Vladimir Komarov. The engineers, having tasted the bitter cost of compromise, never again allowed political deadlines to overrule technical reality. The mission was a failure, but the lesson was a success that has saved hundreds of lives in the decades since. Vladimir Komarov was not a victim of the vacuum of space, or a solar flare, or a rogue meteor. He was a victim of the Cold War. He was a victim of a system that valued propaganda over human life. He went up knowing his fate, a profound act of personal sacrifice to protect his comrade and to expose the system's fatal flaws. His final, broken transmission from the edge of the atmosphere was not just a communication, it was a warning. A final, searing indictment heard across the world. We remember the names of the successful missions, Vostok, Apollo, but the true lessons of space exploration are written in fire. The story of Soyuz 1 is a reminder that the stars do not reward arrogance, and that the only unforgiving frontier is the one created by human haste and political hubris. His honor ensured our safety. His death was the price of the Soyuz's ultimate success. What are your thoughts on Komarov's tragic choice to fly? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of the space race, hit that subscribe button for more deep dive documentaries.